Welcome to the Research Works podcast, live from the European Academy of Childhood Disability Conference 2024 in Bruges, Belgium. Join us for interviews with keynote speakers, world-renowned researchers and clinicians, and behind-the-scenes stories from one of the great paediatric conferences in the world.
Well, we're just out of our first keynote lecture. And in fact, it wasn't quite a lecture, it was a great conversation. And I'm really, really pleased to introduce you today to three of the keynote speakers. I suppose we can still call you keynote speakers because it was a great conversation. So thank you, Sally Lynch, for joining us today from the University College in Dublin. Hello, Sally.
Hello. Thank you for inviting me.
It's so fabulous to have you. Thank you for finding us in the studio today. And we also have Catherine Haslam from the University of Queensland.
Yes, it's great to be here too. So and please, it's Kath.
It's so wonderful. Oh, Kath, I can call you Kath. Yeah. And then Alex Haslam, nice to meet you as well from the University of Queensland.
Thank you. Yeah, wonderful to be here. Yeah.
I have to admit, when I first looked at the schedule and it said the different backgrounds that you have, so Sally, you're a geneticist.
Yes, I'm a clinical geneticist.
Yeah. And then Kath, your background?
Clinical psychologist.
Clinical psychologist. And Alex?
I'm a social and organisational psychologist, yeah.
So when you see them all written down on paper, you go, how does that work? But you guys brought it together beautifully in your keynote today, which was absolutely fabulous. So hopefully we can recreate some of that conversation as well as delving in maybe a little bit deeper to some of those topics. Sally, I'll start with you in terms of your role as a clinical geneticist. Now, you told a very interesting story about Irish travellers, which I've never heard of before. Can you tell us a little bit about that to start?
Yeah, sure. So Irish travellers are, indigenous to Ireland. Mm-hmm. Their DNA is the same as mine. But they diverged from the non-traveller Irish population. We don't know for sure because they were illiterate. And we still have high illiteracy rates amongst them. Right. But we think it's possibly 13th, 14th century. And they're nomadic. So they practice, they kind of get married within the same population and often consanguineous marriages. Right. So as a clinical geneticist, I would see people with hereditary diseases. Yes. So when I came back to work in Dublin from having trained in the UK, I was seeing a lot of families from the Irish traveller population.
Wow. So that was very interesting. So that was a great background. And Kath, in terms of your background, how you came into this area, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as I said in the keynote, I basically got to a stage where I was working as a practitioner. I was working as a clinical neuropsychologist and psychologist. And I was working with a client, a young male adult who basically had come to our service because he had fallen down in a rock climbing, indoor rock climbing activity that he was doing. Yeah. But the interesting thing in his life was that he really struggled to move on. He identified solely as somebody who was physically active. Yeah. And after the fall could no longer be active as a result of the spinal damage that the fall had created. And he'd spent all of his time socially with that group. Yeah. And so he really struggled to try and deal with identity change and loss. Who do you become if you can no longer be the person that you identified as being central to how you make your contribution to the world? Yeah. And I just didn't feel skilled enough to deal with those sorts of issues. And that's what led me to be involved with some of my social psychology colleagues to try and understand how identity actually impacts. Yeah. And it's led to a wider collaboration of research that we have not only in Australia, but with people in the UK, the US, Canada, and Europe, all interested in the way that the social group memberships that we're part of and the identities that they are associated with actually impact our health behaviour and health outcomes. And that's led us to develop the social identity approach to health, which is part of the reason for why Bernard invited us.
I love that. And as you'd explained that's another layer on top of what you just spoke about, Sally. Alex, what about you in terms of what your background was that brought you here?
Yeah. Well, when Cass said she was talking about her collaborators. Well, I'm one of them. I'm her husband. So we hitherto, we've been married. I said we've been married for 30 years, and for I suppose the first 10 years of our marriage, we like going to traveling together. So I'd go to Cath's conferences, she'd go to mine, and she'd sort of hang around the edges, and I'd hang around the edges of hers. And she was saying she started to think maybe the things that we were talking about were kind of relevant to her work. And similarly, I'd be going to a lot of these health conferences and hearing these stories around things, and people were talking in these very physical terms around, and the cognitive things that were going on in very hardcore sort of psychological thing. And you think, no, I think there's a pretty strong sort of identity dynamic here. I think there's a lot of group process that you're not seeing as part of the story.
Yeah.
And so I guess we would talk more about those things, and we'd start fleshing them out, and we'd work some papers. We had other colleagues we brought in. And actually, once you start looking at the data, you shake it down, it comes out pretty straightforwardly. So it wasn't just that it was an interesting story for us to tell and to, as it were, cohere around. It was that it actually brought a lot of additional power to our research. And once we started doing it, we found, well, hey, there's a lot of other people doing this stuff. So it's a pretty big movement. And after this, we're going on to Ireland, actually, and there's a conference on social identity and health, and there'll be a couple of hundred people there from all over the world who are doing this sort of stuff in all manner of different domains. It's really fascinating.
Isn't that brilliant? And I love that this conference, the real theme is societal symphony. They spoke about it early this morning. Professor Bernard Dan was saying it's about collaboration and impact creation. So I thought to bring this together, now we've heard a bit about your backgrounds and what brought you here. I thought a really interesting way to start is to talk about something that a lot of clinicians are very familiar with, I suppose, when it comes to rare conditions, and that's the diagnostic odyssey. Now, Sally, you would experience this a fair bit. It might be a little bit different, though, I suppose, with some of the Irish travellers that you might be working with. But can you explain a little bit about what that sort of process of getting a diagnosis can often look like?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I see lots of people who are not Irish travellers as well in clinic, and bringing a diagnosis does depend on the age of the individual when the diagnosis is made.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference in a newborn, the devastation for parents to compare to if the child is 10, or even if you have an adult who's 20 and you've been waiting 20 years to get a diagnosis, in the reaction from the parents,
Yes.
And so when you're making a diagnosis at 10 or 20, the parents know that you're not going to provide a solution, whereas the newborn, the parents are hoping that there'll be something new that will radically help their child, whereas at 10 or 20, I deal a lot with intellectual disability.
Yes.
So the parents know that that's it for life.
Yeah.
And so the diagnosis, I have seen enough families just cry even though they're 20, that when you get them the diagnosis and they start off saying it doesn't matter, but actually it does.
Yeah.
And, I've seen quite a number of families, elderly parents, that they have just lived for so long and just getting an explanation. I just give you an anecdote. I saw a 17-year-old boy a couple of months ago, and we eventually got a diagnosis for him. So I think we'd started maybe 10 years ago, and he's got a very bad dyskinetic disorder. So it'll be, something like a lot of the patients, the paediatricians here and the physios, etc., are treating. And it's very disabling for him. He moves the whole time. And anyway, I saw him, gave him the diagnosis, and I was seeing him again with the paediatric neurologist in clinic, and the parents said it really helped him because he has two siblings and he's always wondered why he's different.
Wow.
And, I haven't fixed it at all. The neurologist can't fix it, although actually caffeine will help him. But it just made him understand, an explanation to him as to why he was different to his siblings.
Yeah. It's really powerful, isn't it? Because already, as you're saying that, there is a reason, there is an identity. But as you're describing that, a diagnosis isn't just about the person, it's about the whole family and the whole network. So you must work with a variety of stakeholders, if you were to call them stakeholders, I suppose.
Sure. And, you do. So depending on what we were talking about in the keynote was about the different backgrounds of people. So one of my jobs is to signpost people to, different support groups and things like that. So some people will be very engaged and will really want it, and others are much more private. Sure. So you just have to respect that people will engage in whatever way they want.
Yes.
And, I do always encourage people to, I got an email yesterday, for example, from an English geneticist who's looking after an Irish traveller patient, wanting to know, do we have any patients with the same disorder and would they like to engage? And my immediate reaction was, I'll ask my colleague who's more cases. We do have lots of patients with that, but I don't think they will.
Yeah.
So it's just, you have to respect people engage in different ways. And, you just have to respect that. And I suppose within what I was saying in that keynote as well is we can't understand everybody's culture.
I love that you said that.
Yeah. But you just have to, be a bit patient and just respect that they might not take up your offer or not follow what you but you just look, here is if you want to.
Yes.
This is I'm signposting you if you want to.
Yes.
And it doesn't really
That's
matter
right.
to me what you do. It's your decision. Yeah.
I love that you said that, because it's true. You can't be on top of everyone's culture. You're not going to know that, but you can respect it. You can provide them space and provide them with time. Now, Kath, with that in mind, where would things fall into place there for you? Because even as Sally was talking there, it's, identifying potential groups and support networks that they might find helpful. What's the role of those groups?
So I think, just to follow up on Sally's point earlier on, it's from my point of view, it's important to be patient, but it's important to work with those groups in the way that the clients and families that you're working with, respecting the way they want to actually interact with those. I think in the context of receiving a diagnosis, the way that I would kind of sort of see that is that diagnosis is a life change.
Yeah.
And what we know with life changes, it's one type of life change that's in a health context, but we all experience life change. We experience life change when we shift schools, when we transition to university, when we start our first job, when we move, when we retire. All of those are life changes. And one of the things that we actually know, including in the context of illness and diagnosis, is that life change changes our social relationships.
Yeah.
It creates a bit of social upheaval. And it does so because with the diagnosis comes a way that, the relationships and the ties that you have with other people, the way they look at you may actually change. It may cause a little bit of uncertainty in their lives, wanting to think about, what is this going to mean for our relationships moving forward? But it also changes how the family and the client actually relate to others. So, Sally, as you were saying earlier on, sometimes people are very open to support groups, but others aren't because they don't want to necessarily be identified by their illness.
Yeah.
The interesting thing about that is that, so it's important not to be solely defined by your illness, but one of the things that we also know is that if there isn't a part of you, if you totally disconnect from the illness, then accessing those social supports almost becomes impossible.
Yeah.
And the longer term outcomes from that, what the data actually shows is that they're not that positive.
Right.
So somehow trying to work with that diagnosis while at the same time not making it a central part of who you are is an important part of that management.
Yeah.
And the reason why you want to actually work with those groups is because what we know from our evidence is that the groups are a source of psychological resource. In order to be able to cope with these life changes that happen in our lives, diagnosis.
Yep.
We draw on the social supports that we get from other people, the groups in our lives when they're a positive source of influence, when they're ones that matter to us, that we connect with. They're the ones who help us feel more in control of our lives.
Yes.
They build our self-esteem. They give us, they build our coping resources, build our resilience.
Yeah.
They give us meaning and purpose in our lives.
Yeah.
It's those resources that we know are health enhancing, and that's why groups actually make the difference.
Yeah. And I love how you said that too, and how that connects, because it's about relationships, and being patient, like you said, takes time, because you want people to connect, but in their own time, through patience and building those relationships. And I absolutely love that. So Alex, how do you see that when we think about this process? What's your view on that?
Well, I think the bare bones of it have been set up by Sally and Kath. And I think another way of saying much what they've said is diagnosis is delivered in the context of a set of relationships and a set of identities, but the diagnosis often changes those relationships. And what Kath is saying is that the diagnosis is itself often a vehicle for some sort of identity change. And often, of course, if you get a diagnosis, then you're acquiring a new identity, or there's the potential to do that. And it can be often a negative one, like it's associated with some condition or injury, and that can be problematic. And then there's a decision point, or there's decisions to be made about how much you engage with that identity, and do you deny it.
Yes.
And what we see in the research is there's costs and benefits of both engaging and denying it with it.
Yes.
If you engage with it, then you obviously have the opportunity to draw on the support that maybe a support group would provide around that condition, but also you potentially expose yourself to a certain sort of stigma because you're a member of that group that people are afraid of or don't like.
Yeah.
By the same token, if you don't engage with it, then you don't have access to those things. And then the pathways to, if you like, identity gain. So actually what you see in the most positive forms of post-diagnosis outcome is that people acquire a diagnosis, they embrace that, other people help them to construe that and deal with that in positive ways, and they work out positive ways of coping with that and making as much of it as you possibly can. And often sometimes reappropriating that condition. Autism would be a case in point where, again, there are groups, that actually then work together to understand the positive aspects of autism and to see this is not an affliction, but actually something that provides a different perspective on the world.
Yes.
But if you don't identify, you don't want to be part of those communities, you don't have that pathway. So what Kath was really talking about, I think, is also there in the context of diagnosis, you've got definitely got identity change.
Yes.
The question is, and you've potentially got a disruption to identity continuity. I can't be the person that I was going to be. And the question then is it going to be a case of identity gain? Is your condition going to be defined by I've gained an identity, potentially a positive one, or is it going to be defined by identity loss? I'm no longer the person I was, the climber.
Yes.
And then the really interesting thing from my perspective as an organizational psychologist is to understand your role as a clinician, as a leadership role in which you're helping people to manage those identities and negotiate those pathways. And we think about leadership as an identity process. So leadership, we talk about identity leadership. And we think of therapy as identity leadership, where you're clarifying the identity pathways and providing people with access to find the best possible ways of coping with that identity change. And as far as possible, acquiring positive identities where it's possible to do so, but connecting with other people who are going to allow you to explore the positive affordances of a given condition or a given life change. Now, this applies to injury, illness, disability. It applies to retirement. It applies to becoming a parent. It applies to every life change. And the point there about the leadership thing is leadership is providing by anybody who's helping you to negotiate that experience. And that can be a partner, it can be your boss at work, it can be a friend, but often it can be someone, a professional, a therapist, and so on. And I think for me, a big part of our work is really around trying to structure the debate around leadership around this space. So a lot of clinicians don't want to think of themselves as leaders because they think of leadership as this rather actually toxic, top-down, distant thing. And actually I think I'd say, no, that's wrong. Actually, that's not what leadership is. And actually, clinicians have a lot to teach the world about what leadership looks like. It's a collaborative, collective process. It's not about being apart from everybody else and being put on a pedestal and paid a lot of money and getting to treat other people like shit. No, actually, it's about embracing a collective view of who we are and affording possibilities together. And in that way, I think actually good clinical leadership is a model for the leadership that we need to see a lot more of in the world at large.
Gosh, I love that. I really, really love that. I feel like sums up really beautifully, and something that really resonated with me when in your keynote was disability has the potential to divide communities, but it has the possibility to unite. They create a platform for possibilities, and it's that, how do you refer to it? Socially curative. I absolutely love that. So thank you so very much for going through that again with us. I know you've just come off keynote, you've got some coffee, but you probably need a little bit more coffee now. But really appreciate your time for that. And, Professor Bernard Dan, he knew what he was doing putting you guys together.
Well, I think we all had no idea how it was going to go. And it was definitely a unique experience for all of us, but I'm glad we did it.
Gosh,
absolutely. And in fact, you need a good facilitator. So Bernard did a great job.
And critically, he did identity leadership. So he brought together some disparate people and actually said, okay, let's define this shared identity and let's define that pathway.
I never normally go to this conference because I'm a geneticist. You too. So we were all at a conference we wouldn't normally be at.
I love that.
So it was unique for all of us.
Yeah, it's absolutely brilliant. Well, it was lovely to meet you guys. And to all of our listeners, I hope you really enjoyed that. We'll talk to you all again in the next episode. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.